We're about ready to start our panel. I want to welcome everybody to Montpelier today. Our big event today is our panel on is the Constitution in Danger on Constitution Day. First of all, my name is James French. I should have said that at first. I'm the chairman of the Montpelier Foundation and also the founding chairman of the Montpelier Descendants Committee, which is currently headed by my colleague on the board, Larry Walker. And I'm very, very appreciative of the large turnout today. And I know that we have many more people online. This is a really exciting moment for us because this is the first time Montpelier has ever really expanded its coverage from of the Constitution commemoration and celebration of the Constitution from the day to the month of September. And today is kind of being Constitution Day, the 17th of September is extremely important. So this is really an important day. You may have all followed some of the developments at Montpelier recently and know that there's been recently this May the achievement of structural parity on the board of Montpelier. So for the very first time in history, a major historic site is led equally between a legacy board and the descendants of those representatives of the descendants of those who were enslaved at the site. And so this is really cutting edge, exciting history with the aim of providing a more complete history to the American people, public history to the American people. And I'm gonna just describe that a little bit before I introduce my esteemed guests. So Montpelier's recently, and I apologize for reading from notes, but I just wanna do this quickly and tell you a little bit more about what we're doing today. Montpelier has recently acquired a new board that was put together as a result of decades of dedicated stewardship by the descendants of those enslaved here and the neighboring region. The descendants are a group of hundreds of patriotic Americans whose ancestors toiled in anonymity to build this nation. We refer to them as invisible founders. The board also happens to be comprised of some of the most talented people in this nation, drawn from fields of history, science, journalism, community activism, medicine. We have deans of the nation's leading business schools and schools of public policy, and everyday committed Americans, all who have come together to be part of this historic achievement. Quite simply, we believe that we have put together the best and most talented board of any museum in America. Really excited about that and the implications of that for what Montpelier will become. In addition, Montpelier is known for the talents and dedication of incredible staff, all of whom share a passion with the board for preserving the legacy of James Madison, upholding the ideals of the US Constitution and sharing that message with the public. We could not ask for a more talented staff than the one we have. The vision for the new Montpelier is firmly rooted in the idea that the legacy of Madison is not a partisan one, not a political one, but one that belongs to all of us. It's a common American heritage. And we aim through public history to unite Americans through a more complete history. We welcome people of all political outlooks, all walks of life in America. Madison once said, knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives. We're expanding the circle of the origin story by providing a more complete history of this country with fact-based history so that Americans have more of the knowledge that Madison is referring to. It's no exaggeration to say that the landscape that we're on today, this very place, Montpelier, is the literal garden of that origin story. So we welcome you to the beginning of Montpelier's newest and best chapter. And we sincerely thank you for your interest and your support. Our work, we believe, is really important now in a time of division in the country. And we believe with all sincerity that what we're doing is a force for uniting the country. So thank you. And with that, I just want to introduce my panel of esteemed guests. I'm going to start to my immediate left. Michael Higginbotham is currently the Lawrence M. Katz Professor of Law and former interim dean at the University of Baltimore School of Law. Michael is the author of Race Law, published by Carolina Academic Press in 2001. Now in its 5th edition, the book is widely used in colleges and law schools throughout the United States. His latest book, Ghosts of Jim Crow, was published by NYU Press in 2013. He's published numerous articles in journals, including the Yale Law and Policy Review, the Harvard Black Letter Law Journal, and New York University Law Review. He published numerous editorials in newspapers, including the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and the Baltimore Sun. Before joining the University of Baltimore in 1988, Michael was a law clerk to the United States Court of Appeals, Judge Cecil Poole, an associate with Davis Polk, and a lecturer at the University of Pennsylvania. Michael graduated from Beverly Hills High School in 1975, received a Bachelor of Arts degree, magna cum laude from Brown in 1979, a Juris Doctor degree from Yale in 1982, and a Master's of Laws degree with honors from Cambridge University in 1985, where he was a Rotary Scholar. No, welcome, Michael.
Thank you.
To Michael's left, we have Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, who is a senior fellow at the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University and a professorial lecturer at the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. She received her BA with honors in history and political science from George Washington University, her master's and PhD from the University of California, Davis, and her postdoctoral fellowship from Southern Methodist University. Previously, Dr. Chervinsky worked as a historian at the White House Historical Association. Her writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Ms. Magazine, The Daily Beast, The Bulwark, Time Magazine, USA Today, CNN, NBC, Think, and Washington Post. Dr. Chervinsky is the author of the award-winning book, The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of the American Institution, recently out in paperback, and the forthcoming book, An Honest Man, The Inimitable Presidency of John Adams. Welcome, Dr. Chervinsky.
Thank you.
And to your left, we have Jamelle Bouie. And Jamelle, as you know, many of you know, is a columnist for the New York Times, opinion section, and a political analyst for CBS News. And we're very honored by your presence. So thank you very much, Jamelle.
Thank you.
So today we're going to talk a little bit about, the theme is the Constitution in danger, and I'm hoping we can just have a lively conversation about this and see where it goes. America is experiencing a moment of political strife that threatens the core of our democracy. And when Madison established a framework for our founding document in 1787, only a fraction of the population could participate in this new revolutionary form of government. America has not evolved effortlessly towards democracy. It has evolved, but not effortlessly. We offer this panel discussion on the current political crisis, America's vulnerability, and how we can reinvigorate the American democratic spirit. So with that introduction, I just want to throw a question out there for you. In August of 1822, James Madison wrote a letter to W.T. Barry, a member of the Kentucky legislature, who is seeking to create and fund a system of public education. In that letter, Madison articulates his belief that self-governance requires an educated public, stating, quote, "Knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives." So the question is, in this age of digital media, where the public has instant access to information and misinformation, how does Madison's belief in an educated citizenry remain relevant? And just anyone who would like to start this would please feel free.
Well,
Go ahead.
happy to start us off. And let me just say that it's wonderful to be here to celebrate our Constitution. also to be here at Montpelier, this incredible property where the founding principles, many of the founding principles were formulated. To answer the question, I think Madison had it right. I think knowledge is power. And I think education for our populace is essential to an effective constitutional democracy. But I would also say that we have to be very careful in this digital age. Whereas James indicated, there's a lot of knowledge and facts out there, and there's also a lot of falsity and confusion out there. And so I think it's important in our constitutional democracy to make a distinction between false facts and a distinction between ideas that are essential to the marketplace of ideas search for truth. And so when I think about this distinction being important, and it's one that Madison, alluded to in the First Amendment, freedom of speech, as well as the Supreme Court has talked about over the years, how important this distinction is. You cannot yell fire falsely in a crowded theater. Why? Because it's a lie. It's not essential to the search for truth. It's a lie that you know is a lie. And when I was teaching in 2016, teaching constitutional law, and we're talking about politics and the election, and we had an interesting discussion about Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, the pluses and minuses of both candidates. And one of my students said, even if I agreed with Hillary Clinton, even if I agreed with everything she stood for, which I do not, but even if I agreed, I couldn't vote for her because of her involvement with pedophilia. And I tried to keep my game face on as a professor, and I was like, can you explain more about that in detail? And afterwards, I pulled her aside and I said, I'm going to do a little research on this because this is something I'm not sure about. I came back to her the next class and I said, I have 3 articles, one from the New York Times, one from the Washington Post, and one from the Wall Street Journal that provided some facts on this. I don't know whether she was changed or whether it had any influence, but here's why I'm saying this. Because what we need to do is to fight falsity, false facts with true facts. What we need to do is fight bad speech with good speech. And that's what was said about the First Amendment. That's what Madison had in the First Amendment, and that's how the Supreme Court has interpreted it throughout the last 200 years.
Thank you, Michael. Any response to that?
Well, I agree so much with the sentiment. And let me start by saying I cannot think of a better place to spend Constitution Day. And I'm so glad that you are all here with us. It's a real delight and a treat for me. And I think I can speak for all of the panelists to say as much. When Madison talked about an educated citizenry, he obviously didn't really necessarily specify what that education meant. But I think it's fair to say that it wasn't just literacy and basic arithmetic skills. I think what he meant, or I think how we should apply it today, is an element of critical thinking. Because we need to be able to, it's not just that we need to be able to read and learn things, it's we need to be able to distinguish between truth and false facts. We need to be able to know when something doesn't quite pass the smell test or doesn't quite sit right with us. And we need to be able to know how to dig further into that. And one of the themes that I've been grappling with over the last couple of days, because I've received a lot of questions about, what do we do with civics and what do we do with citizenship and what do we do with education? And I think that as the American people, we take voting as a right, but living in a republic is a privilege. And we owe, as part of our citizenship duties to the nation, to be engaged with information, to seek out information, to know who are the different candidates on our ballot and be informed about them so we can make good educated choices. And that's really, I think, what Madison and so many of his peers, Jefferson, believed in the importance of an educated citizenry. Even though they disagreed on a whole lot, Adams agreed with them on this, that it was essential that citizens be able to evaluate the options in front of them, to know when someone was trying to pull a fast one on them, to know when they were being duped. And so I think that is the part of citizenship and civics education that we are missing a bit. It's not just that you can read and write, it's that you can evaluate and apply those skills to our daily political discourse and our daily political life.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mel, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I have a few quick thoughts. And again, thank you for having us. It's a real pleasure to be here. If you guys get a chance, walking along the property is a very lovely thing to do, and the weather is great. So to build off of Michael and Lindsay, Madison's absolutely right to say that education and knowledge is necessary part of having a sustainable republic, democracy, whatever you want to call it. The thing I think I want to add and maybe complicate a little bit is that Madison was also existing in an entirely different kind of information environment, right? This is not a world of mass media. There are newspapers, there are pamphlets and everything, but the kind of immediate mass media that we've had since really the beginning of the 20th century didn't exist at the time. People's knowledge in terms of how they experience the world, how they conceptualize the world, really didn't extend all that far beyond sort of what they could feel and see and touch and immediately experience. And they didn't necessarily need to form opinions about anything outside of that. The typical person didn't need to, think much about what was happening outside of their immediate environment. And so that does structure how knowledge affects politics. You can have things to be a bit more discrete, a bit more concrete. It may be a little harder to pull a fast one on people when people are making claims about things you can immediately see. But as the journalist and scholar Walter Lippmann famously argued in the book Public Opinion, all of this changes when you have mass media, when you have national politics, when you have mass politics of a kind that hadn't quite developed by 1822. What was developing, right? In a couple of years, we'll begin to get there in terms of mass politics. But in an environment of mass politics, of national politics, nationalized politics, of mass media, you're not just making evaluations about the things that you can immediately see and feel and experience, but you're also asked by politicians, by the media, by just sort of like living your life to make judgments and have opinions and have thoughts about things that are far outside of your purview, happening on the other side of the country. And the problem is that it's really hard actually to get accurate information about that stuff. And most people are just living their lives and don't really have the time, nor should be expected to learn the intimate details of what might be happening in Los Angeles, California, if you're out in Wilmington, Delaware, right? Don't necessarily need to really be able to have the details exactly of what's happening in a border town in South Texas if you're up in Minnesota. But you might be called to make political decisions about what's happening in a border town in South Texas, despite not having any direct experience of it. So Lippmann identifies this kind of fundamental problem, this like paradox that we haven't really been able to resolve, which is that modern democracy requires mass media, requires mass communication, requires people to have a national sense of what's happening. But even under those conditions of mass media, even with the availability of information, actually developing an accurate impression is incredibly difficult. And because masses, I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Men in Black. There's a great line in that movie where Tommy Lee Jones is talking to Will Smith, and Will Smith kind of expressing his dismay at the fact that they haven't told people about the existence of aliens, says, well, like, people are smart. And Tommy Lee Jones says, no. A person is smart. People are animals. It's a paraphrase of the line. The line's much more eloquent, and Tommy Lee Jones delivers it very well. But I think that basic insight, which I think is kind of true, should help us understand sort of the problem of mass media and knowledge of education in a modern mass democracy, which is that an individual person might be able to come to some sort of like accurate conclusion to act on, but people acting as a collective have a hard time doing this. And that, I think, is the challenge in the present, that it's not just the fact of misinformation, the fact of falsehoods that exist, but also the challenge of organizing a mass public in a way that can make accurate decisions about what's happening around it.
Thank you. Thank you. Great answers. So, here we are at a museum, and in a museum, we deal with history, right? And so if we are, I think you've brilliantly, all three of you have put out a great expose of how important accurate information is for the day-to-day lives. What about accurate information about where we came from and what our common origins are? Isn't that equally part of what can be used against, used to divide people? And how do we in this age of mass media, of social media, how can we be vigilant against not only current day-to-day information, but images or stories about the past used in a way to divide us? It just seems to me that the problem of information compounds upon itself. Any thoughts about that, anyone?
I mean, I think it's so important that we tell the truth about our history, about who we are. But the truth doesn't have to be divisive. It's not about blame. It's about knowledge. It's about having the information so that we don't make the same mistakes we did in the past, but we get better. And so I think it's very important that we do have books, that we do have teachers that are permitted to give the whole truth about our history, the good, the bad, and the ugly. If I can quote movies too, right? The Clint Eastwood version, right? But I think it's important because, the truth will set us all free, and the truth will make us better so that we don't make the same mistakes we have in the past.
I think history becomes divisive if we put too much of our self-identity in what past generations have done. So if our self-worth or our conception of who we are as a human is where our ancestors came from, or what side of the war they fought on, or whether or not they owned other individuals, then that can become personal really quickly, and it can become very divisive. I think we have to really push back on that notion, because I think our identities should be, who we are in this present moment, what we have done in this present world, how we treat others day to day. If you have a culture that you embrace, that's totally fine. You can embrace that history and that past, but it doesn't mean that you need to necessarily identify with everything that has been done in the past. And one way to, I think, kind of separate that is when we're talking about telling the whole story, the whole history. We're not saying the good outweighs the bad or the bad outweighs the good. Human beings are not an Excel spreadsheet. They are not a ledger. And so we cannot tally up the good things they did, the constitutions they wrote, the amendments they passed, and try to somehow balance them against the number of people they owned. First of all, I don't know how you would even calculate that. So that seems like a pretty foolish endeavor to start trying. But we have to just be able to hold two complex thoughts in our mind at the same time, to say that they did good things and they did bad things. Both are part of the full story. Both are important to the national story. They cannot be balanced. They cannot erase. And that doesn't mean that you can't admire Madison for the things that he wrote, or admire Washington for serving as the first president, and also feel pretty queasy about some of the stuff that was done when they're not crafting the Constitution or not making decisions in the cabinet. Both of those are okay. And I think if we emphasize that both of those are okay, then it maybe takes a little the sting out of the divisiveness.
Kind of related to that, part of, I think, what can make history divisive in public conversations is that I think the typical lay, notion of what history is a set of facts or pieces of information that are basically static, both in terms of how they're produced and also in terms of what they're supposed to indicate. But the truth of history is that neither its production nor the actual events themselves are static in any way, that there is tons of dynamism and change in how modern day scholars understand the past, but also the past itself, like our own lives today and the present. Like, someday, hopefully hundreds of years ago, people will be looking back at our time and trying to figure out like what we thought as people. And they might be tempted in the future to think of our time as being kind of a flat thing with no ripples or ridges. But smart observers in the future, just as smart observers I think today, should recognize that the past is as dynamic and unsettled as it is for the people who were experiencing the past as it is for us. And I think that what that should help us understand is that, let's say we're talking about the Constitution and talking about constitutional change, it should be a reminder to not impose certainty and finality and a static notion of what the Constitution is on the people who wrote it, right? They saw it in unsettled terms as well. And maybe we should, in turn, see it in unsettled terms. But I think kind of the key to that is recognizing that this is all very dynamic, and it's all always changing our understanding. For them, it was very dynamic. They didn't know how a story was going to end. And so that's sort of my big point, that like history, we need to understand history as being something that is in flux and not simply one thing for all, forever and ever. Amen.
Just a brief follow-up. I agree with what Lindsay said about, balancing. There's good and there's bad in all of the individuals. Nobody's perfect. And so it's fine to, look at the great things that James Madison did. And there were some things that he didn't do so well. Earlier this morning, someone asked about what are Madison's views on race and race equality. And one of the things I think we don't do sometimes in this country that we should do more in terms of telling the whole truth, where there were founders who had different views on race. And one of my favorite founders, George Weiss, who signed the Declaration of Independence, freed every slave that he inherited. Upon inheritance, free them all. And so sometimes we don't make that clear that there were differences. And sometimes we look back and say, well, everybody thought this way. Like Chief Justice Taney said in the Dred Scott case in 1857, every civilized person thought this way, that Blacks have no rights that whites are bound to respect. And that's just simply not true. And so it's important, I think, that we honor James Madison, of course, but I think we should also honor people like George Weiss. And sometimes we don't honor them as much. And that's a disappointment to me.
Michael,
just to
please go ahead.
Really quick.
No,
I think that this is what makes history so exciting, right?
Yeah.
Like what's exciting about history is you have two people of a similar class and generation and friends, and they make two fundamentally different moral choices about something that they have in common. And the question is why? And that's the work of history, is like trying to answer that why. And what makes history so exciting is trying to answer that why. And trying to get to the answer to that why requires you to think about this in much less static and rigid terms than I think people are accustomed to.
Absolutely.
I know, we just keep going.
This is exactly what I was hoping for.
So I just want to give an example of how this is a non-static process. And it's not even about social or cultural values sometimes, but about just the information that is available to us. George Washington had a copy of the Constitution that he had printed after the first session of Congress. And it was a copy of the Constitution and all of the bills that had been passed during that first session. And he wrote a number of notations in the margins, which I think should really shape how we think about his approach to executive power, because it was an ongoing thing that he's like literally trying to figure out in the margins as he's getting ready to do his first State of the Union. It was in private hands until 2012. It was not available to scholars until 2012. So when it was then purchased for a very small sum of $10 million by Mount Vernon, and is now in a very locked vault, but there are now reproductions of it that you can see. we have access to this whole new interpretation. And letters are still, especially in New England, where families hold on to houses for a really long time, letters are still coming out of attics that we didn't know were there. And so history has to be a constant reassessment as we have access to new things. And if we don't do that, then we are actually being derelict in our process of scholarship because we're not taking account of all of the information available to us.
You know, this brings up a really good point, and we made it in the last panel, which is history is not a finite resource, and we kind of we tend to think that we speak about it in kind of common parlance as if it's a zero-sum game. So if you add complexity to a certain story, you're taking away from the previous story. And what I'm hearing you say, all of the panelists, are that the unsettled nature of history is in its very essence, an open process. And it's that openness that adds the capacity, the potential for a much more inclusive common history that accounts for the complexities that we encounter in life every day and somehow are not equipped. Getting back to the notion of Madison and knowledge, somehow we're lacking in the knowledge to interpret that complexity. So would you agree that we need that? We need the additional information as it's coming, just from a civic duty standpoint.
Yeah. I don't have a disagreement with that.
Yeah.
That was the easiest question I've asked all day. I love that. Okay, well, so let's move on. We have another question. And so the key ideas that inform the Constitution were conceptualized here at Montpelier by James Madison. He brought these notes to the 1787 Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, where delegates used Madison's idea to draft the founding document. How has the Constitution taken on a nuanced meaning over time with how it's been interpreted by the various branches of our government? This gets a little bit back to your notion, Lindsay, about the notes. You know, you were talking about George Washington and his notes. And here we know that Madison was a meticulous note taker and meticulous scholar. So how has the Constitution taken on a nuanced meaning over time, and how has it been interpreted by the various branches of our government? Just throw that out there for some thoughts.
Does the lawyer want to start?
I'm happy to start. I'll start it up. I think when I think about nuanced decisions, and as was mentioned, you know, I'm the lawyer and the law professor in the room, so I focus on the Supreme Court. And as I think about nuanced decisions by the Supreme Court, I think about Charles Dickens in The Tale of Two Cities. He said it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. The best of times was Marbury versus Madison, 1803. And yes, that's James Madison got sued before the United States Supreme Court when he was Secretary of State. But the reason why I say it was the best of times was because it's not because Madison won. He did win the case. He didn't have to give a job to William Marbury. But the real winner of the case was the American people, because what the Supreme Court did in ruling for Madison was to say, we have the power of judicial review. We have the power to strike down legislation or acts by the president that conflict with the Constitution. Most people were shocked by this. I mean, it's not in the Constitution. So when you start thinking about nuanced decisions, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court who wrote the decision, John Marshall, basically came up with this by saying it's implied in the Constitution. And so the reason why the American people won was because in terms of checks and balances, in terms of the separation of powers principle that was so important to Madison, was because we had a better balanced system. We now had three branches that were really co-equal branches, because before that, the court wasn't powerful at all. Now it became just as powerful as the legislative branch and the executive branch. And so to me, that was the best of times. Worst of times, Gus, it has to be Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. Everybody knows about the decision, but here's the nuance. We have an equal protection clause that's put into the Constitution in 1868. If you look at the intent of the framers of this document, the intent was, look, we're going to, eliminate race discrimination. This is going to cut it all out. And then all of a sudden, the Supreme Court, in a very nuanced decision, the Supreme Court says, well, we're going to interpret equality in a different way, separate but equal. And it's hard for me to even get that out because the court did not require equality. It required substantial equality, and that was not even close. But the real problem with the decision, when they said, we're going to characterize this decision as one that embraces liberty. It embraces choice. Americans have the choice of choosing integration or segregation. You want to talk about nuance. What the justices did, if they really believe, and they made a statement in the case, they basically said, if people want to integrate, what they can do is if they have natural affinities and mutual appreciation, they can choose to integrate. Now, here's the fallacy. Here's the nuance of that. If the justices really believe that, they would have required Louisiana to do something different than it did in its statute, because its statute says Blacks and whites cannot sit on the train together. Now, if they really believed that it was about liberty, it was about choice, they would have required 3 cars. One for Blacks, one for whites, and one for those with mutual appreciation and natural affinities. And here's the real problem with this nuance. The problem is they didn't give Americans a choice. See, I would have liked to have seen who was in that 3rd car. Right. Would have been a whole lot of Americans, including me.
That's an excellent answer. Thank you. Jamelle.
So the question is about how sort of the branches over time have changed the understanding of the Constitution. But I think I'm going to take this, I'm going to add a 4th branch. And the 4th branch I'm going to add are the American people themselves. And I think that what is often lost or not fully understood is how even in the first 50 or 60 years of American history or history of the United States, understanding of what the Constitution was changed radically. I mean, you could even say in the first 30 years, it changed radically. And so in 1787, 1788, the Constitution was ratified. The Federalists who supported ratification of the Constitution, they understood the document as a kind of restriction on the more radical forms of democratic life that had emerged since the American Revolution. One just my favorite tidbits about the 1787 convention is that like Rhode Island isn't there; it's not represented. Right. And Rhode Island, their response to this was sort of like, we're not going to send delegates to this illegitimate convening to try to restrict democracy. And so that was sort of like the Federalists, they did see the Constitution as something that was putting a limit on how the American public could express itself. James Madison, ahead of the 1787 convention, wrote a document basically sort of like, reaming the states for being these like, uncontrollable and not compatible with any kind of sort of like strong national government. And he understood the Constitution, even in the form that it eventually was at the end of the convention, as something that was like limiting, in a sense, people's like democratic participation. But then you fast forward to the 1810s, beginning of the 1820s, you have Americans referring to their country as a democracy in common parlance. You have a political party that claims Jefferson and Madison as its fathers emerge in the late 1820s. We call it the Democratic Party today, but how people commonly referred to it was as the democracy. And you have Madison himself, former skeptic of democratic participation, writing a letter to John C. Calhoun, the South Carolina, at the time, I think he was a senator, maybe he was vice president. I think he was vice president at the time. The South Carolina slaveholder, vice president, kind of famous kind of theorist of reaction in American politics. Calhoun is arguing that the states have this power to nullify, that you cannot actually trust majorities to rule in a way that is conducive to liberty. And you have Madison, who maybe at an earlier stage in his life might have even agreed with that, disagreeing completely, writing a letter saying, no, the only sovereign that makes sense for a free people is the majority. And I think what you see in that development is Madison's experience with practical politics, Madison's experience with party politics, and the American people's experience with party politics, changing how people understood what the Constitution was, not necessarily as a charter to restrict, but a charter to facilitate democratic participation, a charter to make democracy more real. And as the 19th century progresses on, you see this view really increase, especially in the debates over slavery in the 1840s and 1850s. Anti-slavery politicians looking back to the Constitution, looking back to the founders, looking back to the Declaration, and taking material that, if read, I mean, honestly, if read in its context, may not necessarily hold up to their analysis, but saying, in effect, no, that what it means now for us today, given our experiences, given what we assume, given what our ideals are, it means something more expansive and more inclusive and more democratic, and that's what it should mean. And so I think, you know, my answer to the question, one thing I'd posit to you, the audience, is that even if you are inclined to believe that the Constitution means one thing, and it always has, I would say that its interaction with how the American public and how the American people, not just those who are enfranchised, but those that have been disenfranchised as well, has actually quite fundamentally changed what these things mean. And you can see that change happen on the ground, even if it doesn't show up in the document itself, even if it doesn't show up in an amendment, even if it takes decades for it to show up in an amendment. To kind of put a bow on my answer real quick, the 14th Amendment establishes birthright citizenship. If you're born on American soil, you're an American citizen. That idea emerges at the beginning of the 19th century, really among free Blacks in places like Baltimore. Great scholar Martha Jones has written quite well about this. Free Blacks in cities where they could live, sort of making a claim to American citizenship, saying that, we belong here. This is our country too. We are citizens. And their advocacy and activism and scholarship and arguments help put this idea into the air, into the atmosphere, that ends up transforming our understanding of what the Constitution is. And that process, I think, is as important, if not more important, than whatever changes of understanding come as a result of the political branches themselves doing their things.
Thank you.
So I would take this concept of interpretation and nuance even farther back. When we now tend to treat the Constitution as this almost holy relic in our society. It is as close to a religious document as we get. When most of the delegates left the Constitutional Convention, they kind of felt meh about the document. Washington wrote, he sent out several copies to various of his friends and correspondents, and he said it was the best that we could get. There were a lot of things I really wanted that didn't happen. We had to make a lot of compromises. It was the best that we could get. Madison sent it to Jefferson. Jefferson reamed it out, and he kind of had to defend some of the elements, but it was clear that it was viewed as a compromise document, a series of compromises that were copied and pasted together to get enough of the states, enough of the delegates on board to form a more powerful union that would be preserved at least long enough to get the states through the next series of hurdles. Adams thought they would be very lucky if it lasted 10 years. Jefferson was a little bit more optimistic and thought that 19 years would be a really good run, and then maybe it should be revised completely. Every generation should do a new constitution. So this approach to it is obviously wildly different than we now view this document. And if we actually look at the text, especially things like Article 2, they are so short. There are so few things written down, and a lot of the language is very vague, and there are a lot of intentional silences. And I believe that at specific moments, especially, that crafting is quite intentional. So, for example, when they're trying to figure out what the president is supposed to do, everyone knows that if the Constitution is ratified, Washington is going to become the first president. There is no question. The only other person with the same national stature is Benjamin Franklin. He's very, very old. And in fact, he died a couple of months into Washington's presidency. He was not an acceptable candidate. So everyone knows it's going to be Washington. Washington's sitting in the room staring at them while they're having these debates about, presidential malfeasance and how to remove a president and what if the president does something bad. And that must have been incredibly awkward. And so in some ways, it was easier to leave some things unspoken, trust that Washington would make decent choices and fill out the fuzzy bits of the presidency enough for the next person. And they got pretty lucky that the choices he made were good and decent choices for the most part. But so I think that approach, the expectation that there was more to fill out, there were things that still had to be decided. The Bill of Rights, the executive departments, and the federal judiciary didn't even come until the summer of 1789, once the Constitution was already ratified, which, by the way, I think is the high watermark for congressional productivity in a session ever, never to be surpassed. But so I think that they had this mentality that, of course, things were going to have to be reevaluated. Of course, there was going to have to be evolution. Of course, there was going to have to be nuance and things that they couldn't possibly anticipate because they didn't know how it was going to work out. They didn't know what was going to come down the road, just like we can't predict our future, neither could they predict theirs. And so that intentional flexibility, that expectation that future generations would have different ideas and should have different ideas and should come up with more creative solutions was, I believe, baked in from the very beginning. And we've actually lost that. And I think because we've lost that, we're almost doing a disservice to that legacy because we're not willing to continue to try and come up with new ideas. Or if we do come up with them, then we can't figure out how to actually amend them because the amendment process is so difficult. So I think that's really where we've actually kind of let down that legacy, and we should pick it back up again and say, this is actually what they wanted us to do, as opposed to treating them as though they had all the answers.
So Lindsay, you're bringing this conversation exactly to where I was hoping that it would be going. And I see the three of you kind of looking at nuance from different lenses, right? So Jamelle, you're talking about the people as the fourth branch, and just kind of when things that are written hit the ground, another force takes over, and it kind of it is modified by the way that people interpret it over generations, and it just changes. There's a certain energy in the population that interprets things one way your father did, and the next generation with more people from different origins differently. Lindsay, I think what I'm hearing you say is that from its very inception, you have Washington, who's this incredibly imposing presence sitting in the room. No one wants to tell Washington what to do. And so I love that image where he's just kind of staring at people writing.
I'm thinking of the reverse. I'm thinking of like a bunch of Madeira stained cranky guys, sort of like, what are we going to do? What power does the president have? And they kind of just look up at Washington like, don't worry about it.
And Michael, you're taking the view that these nuances are negotiated by the Supreme Court and that they are interpreted by the court after Madison versus Marbury in very textual ways, perhaps, that have different meanings as they are written by different courts. The court is populated by different people. So you're all kind of looking at nuance in very different ways. And Lindsay, what you said at the very end, which is we have a legacy of nuance, a legacy of change, right? And you think that we've lost it. You've kind of answered the question that I want to ask you, which is what about now? Where are we today in terms of our ability to approach the Constitution with nuance? And are we, with the previous discussion about our information age, are we able to recapture that? Are we able to to confront the challenges we have today with these, where we are today with nuance? Just, it's an unfair question in the sense that I'm asking you to perhaps project, but we're a museum, but we're also living in the present day. So how would you see those very same factors being applied today?
You want me to go first?
I was looking at you because you were looking at me. But anybody.
I think I'm inclined to agree with Lindsay that I think Americans have lost the imagination, not the capacity, but the imagination to think about their institutions in different ways. I think we tend to see them as set in stone, as calcified. I think why we see them that way varies, for many different reasons, but I think that's how we see them. In that, I think that maybe, I do think the institutions themselves are maybe an impediment to kind of addressing some of our problems, but maybe even the bigger impediment is just that lack of imagination, that inability for so many Americans to look at the system and ask themselves, is this actually working the way we want it to work? Is this working the way it works according to the ideals that we might have about what the United States is, what kind of democracy it is, what kind of republic it is? I use those words interchangeably because they mean practically the same thing. There's a whole thing that people say that's we're republic, not a democracy, but republic is just Latin for the people and democracy is Greek for the people. So it's sort of that's the difference. It's sort of, if you want to cite the Federalist Papers, it's sort of Madison is speaking specifically about kind of the Athenian assembly, which is the first form of democracy. And that's what he's railing against. But the idea of representation and all of that, which is what he called a republic, we just all call that democracy today. So that's why I'm using the two interchangeably, because they're two words for the same thing, different languages. But I think Americans need to sort of maybe recapture a little bit of the audacity of the framers. I'm someone who both has a lot of mean things to say about the framers, but also quite a bit of admiration for them. And my admiration comes, even as I kind of just certainly disagree with a lot of their choices, my admiration comes from the fact that they had the audacity to take the Constitution for them, the Articles of Confederation, which was at the moment the Constitution, and say, this doesn't work. This doesn't work for what we're trying to do. And it doesn't help us meet the crises we're meeting. This economic depression we're facing, foreign powers on every border threatening the integrity of our republic. This does not work. And so we have to change something. And rather than make incremental changes, that's what a bunch of the delegates to Philadelphia thought was going to happen. We're going to make some tweaks here and there. Madison and his allies showed up and were like, no, we're gonna change the whole thing. We're going to write a whole new constitution and figure out something that works much better. And I'm not necessarily saying that we ourselves need to write a whole new constitution, but I am saying that we probably should have a bit more of that audacity to look at our governing document, look at our society, look at our ideals, and ask ourselves seriously, is this doing what we want it to do? Because if it isn't, then we should change it. And there's as Lindsay said, there may not be anything more American, more sort of in the spirit of American democracy than looking at our systems and our institutions and saying, let's change them.
Thank you.
Sure. So, I think that I have sort of a two-pronged approach that I see to this issue. So the first is, I think, if going back to the first question about education and the importance of information and critical understanding, I think if the American people had a better understanding actually of how the government process worked, they could more effectively articulate and push for changes that would actually make it a difference. Maybe it's not, maybe rehauling the Senate at this moment is not in the cards for this year, but there are specific changes that could be made that would have an impact day to day. So when people specifically push for bipartisan legislation, it is still possible. There was a bipartisan infrastructure bill that will improve roads and bridges for people in a real and tangible way. There are certain reforms to the electoral transition process that are real and concrete and could be done with relatively little effort that would make a difference to bolster institutions. I think the problem is that because a lot of people don't really understand how the process works, and they see all of these news stories about gridlock and fighting and politics and disagreement, and they think, well, it's not working, let's just throw the whole thing out. I think I saw a poll that something like, I think it was like 40% of Americans were like, well, maybe an authoritarian system wouldn't be so bad, which is like, no, too far. And so, I think that comes from a place of not actually understanding how the process works, because it's easy to get disillusioned and to think that the whole thing is failing if you don't actually understand sort of the minutia, which I don't blame people for not always understanding the minutia. It can be very complicated. So civics education is a really good thing. Involvement and understanding of passing bills, but also local government. Local government affects so much, and we've abandoned so many of those things. So many positions are uncontested, or there aren't even people running for local positions, when they can change your children's schools and they can change so much about your daily existence. So that's sort of prong one. Prong two are like the big ideas, the changing the Senate, which I think is probably, there's no institution that is perhaps less democratic in our society than the Senate. Those big ideas are going to take a really long time, and they're going to require a push for things, but amendments sometimes take a really long time. And it requires that audacity. It requires that willingness to engage in the big ideas and to push for it. And to not get disheartened, because sometimes people getting disheartened is actually is the goal. If people are disheartened and they don't care, then they're much easier to defeat. And so I think that the goal is not to be happy, but it is to be engaged.
Couple of thoughts. Democracy here in America may be the worst form of government ever, right? Except for all the others, right? Except for all the others. We may have lost our mojo for the time being. We've got a whole lot of issues. But the genius of the founders, separation of powers, principle of federalism. And so as Lindsay mentioned, there's a lot of things that can be done on the local level. So when Congress isn't functioning so well, you can do a whole lot of things at the state and local level so that things will happen. It's just they happen in a different way. And so that is, to me, the genius of the founders. Now, today, we, as Lindsay mentioned, we may need to do some bigger things. The Senate is not functioning too well. But here's the thing. The founders set this thing up so it would be very difficult to change the Constitution. When you see supermajority numbers in the Constitution, like 2/3 or 3/4, that means it's really, really hard, really hard to make a change. And so, maybe we need to alter that. Maybe we need to make it a little easier, not simple majority, but maybe we need to alter the numbers a little bit to make it a little easier to change the Constitution. We haven't done it very often. But the important thing is that we keep making things better, that we remember what they said in order to form a more perfect union, that we keep striving to make things better, whether it's done by Congress, whether it's done by state and local governments, or whether it's done by the Supreme Court in its interpretation.
Thank you, Michael. I just wanted to drill down a little bit. So in the next question, we could talk perhaps a little bit about some of the things we might want to make a little bit better, and then talk about how after that. How did the Constitution forge a legal landscape that was in parts inherently unequal? And how does this legacy still impact America today? Any thoughts on that? And then we can talk about some civic engagement.
Well, that's an easy one. Jamelle and Lindsay, you want to talk about that one?
There is one very easy and obvious answer. But I'm going to take the question in a somewhat different direction, including kind of inclusive of the obvious answer, which is that, the Constitution, the process of making the Constitution were, for the moment, for like the late 18th century, remarkably democratic. Like even the initial Constitution, French Constitution after the French Revolution, the first phase of the Revolution, wasn't nearly as democratic in its like production as the American Constitution was. Ratification was, for the time, kind of a mass political event that involved at least white male Americans across the social spectrum. So, stipulating that, it's also true that the Constitution makes no meaningful gestures towards what we might call political equality. One person, one vote, everyone counts equally for the sake of representation. The Constitution attempts to create different forms of representation. It attempts to make representation substantive, meaning that people aren't just votes in Congress, they actually have like an affirmative duty to do things. But the idea that every American citizen, every person in the country has equal political worth, regardless of where they live or what their station is not an idea that's in the Constitution. And I think that it is the idea that must be included in our political and constitutional order for things to work the way we want them to. I think trying to include political equality into our constitutional order kind of like implies a certain set of pretty drastic changes, right? Like the Senate can't exist in its current form, right? Like equal representation of states, which I'll note as a parenthetical that Madison did not like, really did not like. His whole, one of his main goals at the convention was to get rid of equal representation of states. And he failed to do it. He got outvoted on that score. It's funny in the Federalist paper, I think it's like Federalist 50 something, when Madison is describing the Senate and sort of like describing what it is and kind of defending it, he says, well, its scheme of representation is that all the states count equally. And there's not really any justification for that. It's just we had to do it. We had to do it. And I'm not gonna bother trying to defend it. Let's just move on. Which gives you a sense of his view of it. He's like, this is bad.
Not what he wanted.
But I think if you take seriously the idea of political equality, which I think we should, I think over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries, we have come to kind of like at least treat it implicitly as a value. If someone were to draw, part of the reason people get all up in arms about gerrymandering, right, is that it's a pretty obvious example of how you can design the electoral system to make some people count less than other people. And Americans, I think, across the spectrum find that like intuitively wrong. And that intuition is, I think, an intuition towards political equality. We may look at various institutions and say, well, I like the Electoral College or I like the Senate because it advantages my political team, my partisan membership. But when you start asking people about, how does it feel that, some person gets X amount of time representation than you do? People don't like that. And I think it's because we have developed an intuition towards some kind of political equality. So for me, the thing that the Constitution does not do is institute that. You can sort of see what that means over time in terms of slavery, in terms of women's rights, in terms of the rights of Native Americans, and in terms of how our political institutions operate. And I think that we would be better off if we took affirmative steps, not just through sort of interpretation of the Constitution, but actually changing the structure to account for what I think is a general belief among Americans that, yeah, we all count equally politically. An addendum to that, it's not quite the same, but the thing I'll add is the Constitution doesn't take political parties seriously, doesn't even really mention them. It's not part of the institutional arrangement. Famously, all of the founders were like, political parties are terrible, we hate them. And then most of them who lived past 1800 like promptly joined political parties. I would say that we should not underestimate how much the Constitution not being built to equip political parties actually is a really big problem, and it sort of distorts the way the system is supposed to work. And that maybe one thing we should also think about is how can we design a political system that actually incorporates and takes seriously the fact that we have political parties and will always have political parties. There's no democracy in existence that does not have political parties. They're a part of democratic life. So maybe they should be part of our constitutional order as well.
Jamelle makes a great point in terms of focusing on political equality. It's not in the Constitution. It's not in the original Constitution. The Supreme Court has done a number of cases interpreting that, and they have made some tremendous progress. Baker versus Carr, Gamillion, Lightfoot, these are cases that have talked about one person, one vote and making more political equality. They could have done an even better job, and there's some recent cases dealing with redistricting where they didn't sort of take the next step forward. And there's some real problems there, which hopefully will be improved upon by Congress, as well as perhaps interpretations by the court. The equality question about why we have so much inequality today. And the reason why I say that's kind of an easy thing to look at is because, of course, hundreds of years of slavery and then 100 years of Jim Crow segregation certainly is primarily responsible for today's inequality. And look, you can disagree about a whole lot of things, but when you look at the socioeconomic index, every category under it, every category, there are tremendous disparities between whites and others in our society. But the real problem I see today are interpretations by the Supreme Court, such as the 1987 McCleskey versus Kemp decision. Because a lot of people say, okay, Jim Crow and slavery, that's a long time ago. What's going on today? McCleskey versus Kemp has got to be one of the worst Supreme Court cases ever. It's a death penalty case. Individual was tried and given the death penalty. On appeal, Warren McCleskey argues that the death penalty in Georgia has a 5-to-1 differential based on race. The race, his race being Black, and the race of his victim, who was white. Because of those factors, those two factors, there's a 5-to-1 differential. Case goes up to the Supreme Court, 5-4 decision, which many of these decisions on racial equality are. 5-4 decision. And what the majority in the court says is, we accept McCleskey's statistical argument that the statistics are fine. We have no question at all that there's a 5-to-1 differential. We have no question at all that the history of Georgia capital sentencing is racist. But the majority, 5 justices, say, we need more than those two factors. We need intentional race discrimination, which we don't see from these two factors alone. But we need more. The 4 in dissent, including Thurgood Marshall, conscience of the American judiciary, the only justice to have ever lost a client to the state. He was 32-3 before the Supreme Court. One of the 3 losses was a capital case where his client was executed. Marshall and the dissenters say, when we see these two factors, history of race discrimination, huge statistical disparity, the hair on the back of our neck stands up. We say there's something wrong. And so the 4 in dissent say, this is enough to establish an equal protection violation, or at least to shift the burden onto the government to say why it's not racial, why it's not racial discrimination. Most powerful thing I've ever seen in the dissent. And you want to understand why we have such tremendous inequality on race today is because the dissent said, the majority says if we accept the dissent's position, that's going to call into question our entire criminal justice system. That's going to call into question the foundation of our criminal justice system. And the response of the dissent, Justice Brennan writing the dissent, Justice Brennan said, I think the majority has a fear of too much justice, a fear of too much justice. 2 justices in the majority have gotten off the court. They said, we made a mistake. We made a mistake in that case. We should have been with the dissent. 5-4 decision, that means it's 6-3. But they're no longer on the court. So I mention this case because the standard for establishing racial discrimination in the Constitution is way too high, right? You got to have a tape of the juror saying, I'm not going to convict this person because of their color. Or the judge saying, well, I'm going to give a death sentence because of the color. If you don't have that, the standard is really hard. And so you want to understand why we continue to have so much inequality today. Part of it is because our laws are not directed at reducing or eliminating it.
So to pick up on, to kind of pull both of these ideas together, not only are our laws not directed at it, but the political incentives are not aligned with it. And that is largely because of the way the Senate is formed. So right now, when we talk about elections, when we have an upcoming election, we don't talk about 50 states. We talk about Pennsylvania, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Nevada this year. We talk about a handful of states. And so the reason that it is that way is because there are a couple of big states that always go in one direction. There are a bunch of other smaller states that always go in one direction. And so they're discarded. They are not campaigned for, which means their interests are not campaigned for. So, for example, I don't remember the exact statistics, but I think there are something like 10 times more teachers employed in the United States than people employed in the coal industry. We don't really talk about teachers. I mean, this year we're kind of talking about teachers because of the pandemic, but usually teachers are not a campaign issue. But the coal industry and the future of those workers is a huge hot button issue. And that is because Western Pennsylvania happens to have a fairly large industry in this one section, or for this Senate, West Virginia. So what that means, though, is that in places like Mississippi, that have some of the worst examples of this really bad institutionalized discrimination and institutionalized impediments to equality, those interests don't really matter because that state is always going to go in one way. And so the entire structure is built to sort of disregard a lot of the interests of people in California or New York, or, because they always go one way, or in places like Alabama or Mississippi, because they always go the other. And so it is not an issue that just is disadvantageous to Democrats or just disadvantageous to Republicans. Most people are actually really come out on the bad end of this calculation because so few states are prioritized under the current electoral college system because of the way the Senate is. So Senate.
Yeah, it's interesting to ask a question like, how would the federal government, how would politics respond to rising sea levels on the coast if both parties had to compete for votes in Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, and Florida? Like if competition for votes in the Gulf was,
or New York City,
or New York City, like if competition for votes in the Gulf was as fierce as its competition for votes in Wisconsin, how would politicians in the system respond to concerns over climate? If competition over California, one of my favorite little facts is that there are more Trump voters in LA County than there were like in the entire Mountain West. It's sort of just like, North the Dakotas, Montana, and Wyoming, like add up all the Trump voters in that part of the country. And there's more Trump voters in LA County than in that entire region of the country, more Trump voters in Cook County, Illinois, home of Chicago, than like in the state of Oklahoma. So, which is to say that like America is very politically diverse. I think our electoral college maps kind of like obscure the extent to which there's no place that is blue or red. All places are like little dots of blue and red at the very granular level. But because there's no meaningful political competition in California, at least no meaningful party competition in California, the fact that huge numbers of Californians, and many of them, red voting Republicans, face like disastrous wildfires is sort of like it's like a curiosity for national politics, sort of like, oh, it's really bad that there are all those wildfires in California, but not like a matter of like urgent concern that would like create a coalition, a national coalition to do something about it. And I think this is sort of what I'm trying to get at when it comes to the political equality question. It has real implications for how our system approaches problems facing millions of Americans, regardless of whatever their partisan identification is. The fact that some votes count more than others matters, not just for who wins an election, but who is represented in the government and who gets their interests addressed by the government.
Thank you. So I want to make sure the audience has time to ask questions here, and this has been such a really rich discussion. So I'm going to kind of combine the last two questions so we can open this up. In 1830, during the final years of his retirement, Madison was pondering his legacy. That year, concerned about the growing political rhetoric to enshrine states with greater power while reducing that of the federal government, Madison penned advice to the country in a letter he requested sealed until after his death. When the letter was opened upon his death in 1836, right here, Madison's words reminded the nation about the importance of unity. Madison wrote, "The advice nearest to my heart and deepest in my convictions is that the union of the states be cherished and perpetuated." As we sit here today, at the place where he first penned these words, knowing that our democracy faces challenges, how do we ensure that American democracy lives on? And this was to be our final question. And the one before that was about the importance of civic engagement, which I think relates to a lot of what you've been talking about in the absence of easy changes to the Constitution. I think, Jamelle, you talked a lot about how the democratic spirit of the American people plays a role. So maybe combining those two questions, how do we ensure that American democracy lives on?
I'll take it. First, I want to quickly note how wild it is that Madison died in 1836. That's just like, he was like 30 something in 1787. 32. Yeah. Born in
I think, right? Did I get the birthday right?
I think it's about 1750 something. Yeah. So just that
I'm such a slacker.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just that this guy, saw. I mean, he essentially saw the collapse of one entire political order, the rise of another political order, and then like the fundamental kind of reorganization of that political order over the course of his lifetime. And I think one thing I like about that letter he wrote is I think it reflects so much of sort of his own almost like serenity, sort of like he's seen so much change over the course of his life and still remains kind of fundamentally optimistic, I think, about the American people's ability to kind of like keep this whole thing going. And I'm optimistic about that too. Part of optimism is that I think that for all of the justified, warnings and worries, I don't think this country is facing a crisis anything like it was in 1860, right? I don't think we're facing a crisis like we were in 1929 or the aftermath of 1929. I think that in terms of national crises, to the extent that you believe that there is one, this one is, not great, but not the worst. And I also, I do think that when like the pressure is on, I think Americans have a remarkable ability to adapt and to find solutions and to find changes. And so I think that sort of the American spirit of democracy, the American ideals of democracy, which in my mind are like much bigger than the Constitution. The Constitution is like one way to actualize them, but there are many ways to actualize them. I think that spirit of democracy, of American democracy, is going to, it's going to assert itself, not of its own accord. People have to do hard work to do this, but I think it will assert itself in terms of trying to come to some sort of resolution about the problems we face.
Thanks.
So you mentioned that democracy is the very worst, except for everything else. And that's true. I would go one step farther, which is to say that a democracy or a republic is the hardest form of government. It is much easier to have a system that is dictated from the top down, where there is no room for discord, where there is no room for conflicting opinions. It's much harder to engage in debate with people and to disagree and say, I think you are absolutely nuts, but I respect your right to believe that and to still have a vote.
Or you don't respect the right to believe it, but you're not going to do anything about that.
Exactly. You can still vote, even though I don't respect it at all.
I'm going to solve it in the voting group.
Yeah, exactly. And so there is something to be said for the fact that we have the longest running national constitution. In the longest state constitution is Massachusetts, which was penned by John Adams. The longest national constitution is ours in the globe. And that is a remarkable feat. And I think the key is, and this is, I think, what Madison is saying, and also what Washington was saying when he retired, is that we have a lot more in common than we have different. And we get into trouble when we focus on the differences and not the commonalities. Abraham Lincoln said, I don't like that person. I need to go get to know them. Which I don't know that I have the grace to do that, but I think that sentiment is the right one, which is obviously easier said than done. But I think I have a couple of like real changes that we could make that would bring that neighborly spirit more into our system. So I want to sort of, on my final answer, give like actual common sense fixes that I think would help with this kind of thing. So I'm not just being negative. And the fixes are as follows. So first, as we talked about earlier, engagement in local activities, whether it's your school board or your HOA or your town council, whatever it is, makes a huge difference. Also, it's a lot harder for people to say nasty things to each other face to face. So we have to, and I think that I'm sure you've experienced this too. I get lots of fun emails, but people aren't really willing to say that to your face because then you're human and you're real. And so if we can engage, we can start to sort of take down some of those barriers. So we have to do that engagement off of Twitter, myself included. So that's sort of the first piece. And then building up from there, I think there are some changes to our electoral systems that can start to actually value every vote in every system. Now, some of them, like the Senate, would require constitutional amendments, which I don't think is impossible. And I do think there are some good solutions, but some wouldn't require constitutional amendments, including things like switching up how we do our primaries so that we have an open primary with ranked choice voting. People are much more likely to be cordial and less nasty if you are in an open primary system or you have a ranked choice voting system where you're trying to campaign for someone's second place votes. So that would, I think, help to change the tenor of our elections, which would go a long way. Then if in our states we had proportional, what's the word I'm looking for?
Representation.
Thank you. Such that we had, so Nebraska does this and Maine does this. They split their electoral votes, which means it's not a winner take all system, which I think would allow for more political interest to be represented on the national stage and would help build coalitions, which is, I think, one of the things that we are missing. So those are some ways that we could sort of force civic engagement through legislation, which wouldn't require amendments, and I think would have a real concrete difference.
Thank you.
One of the reasons I love serving on panels like this is because I get so many good ideas. Jamelle and Lindsay, I'll tell you, they give me a whole lot of good ideas. Now I got 3 books I need to write. James saved the easiest question for last, because civic engagement, how to make things better. One of the things I think we've lost in the country, and both Jamelle and Lindsay touched on this, we've lost our sense of team. That, look, we're all Americans. We're all on the same team. Every now and then I see it, like with the Olympics or maybe with 9/11. Every now and then I see, hey, yeah, we're Americans all on the same team. But with this divisive politics and in our society, these divisions, it seems like we've lost that sense and we need to get it back. Civic engagement can do that. because it makes you feel like you're a part of the team. And in order for the team to be successful and win, sometimes you have disagreements, but you have to work with those people that you disagree with so that the team wins. In terms of making things better, the way we do that is to stay faithful to the Constitution and the principles. And if we keep those things in mind, we'll make a more perfect union.
We'll be okay. Thank you very much. So now I'd like to open the conversation up to our audience. And we have Katie in the background, in the back of the room, who is going to field questions both virtually and in the room.
Hi, thank you for the great discussion. It was excellent. It was excellent. So loss of sense of team, the divisiveness, all of this stuff is resonating. And what I would like to get your opinion on is, how do you think that term limits for federal elected officials might also get us there a little quicker? Because I personally see the divisiveness of our working government somewhat being motivated by the fact that, we elect these officials. And then once they get elected twice, it's almost like they're in there for life. And then it becomes their issues. And then things become very divisive. And then it seems like we can't do anything without trying to kill each other first. So my question is just, what are your thoughts on term limits and whether that could help? Thanks.
Go ahead.
I feel like I have the kind of generic political scientist view on term limits, which is that I think that they might be a remedy worse than the actual problem, which is that, for as much as I'll be the first to say, yeah, it gets old when you have someone who's been in office for 30 years, right? Like a 5-term senator or 15-term congressman. That's a bit much. There was an election in Alaska. Representative Don Young, who passed away. Dan Young. And it was his replacement was chosen. Replacement was a Democrat, Mayor Vitalta. And the news was like, oh yeah, this is the first Democrat to represent the seat, ever since Young has had it for 50 years. It seems like a problem. The flip side of that, though, is that if you think of Congress as not just being a singular entity, but sort of like a set of, multiple institutions within it, multiple centers of power within it, part of the advantage of long-serving representatives is that they actually accumulate a bunch of power amongst themselves. Power, expertise, knowledge, big pieces of legislation, to the extent that it's going to happen in part because these members have, 10, 20, 30 years of experience to shepherd a bill from conception to passage. The problem of term limits is you kind of eliminate that can't happen anymore. But there still needs to be knowledge, right? There still needs to be people with expertise. And so instead of the expertise being cultivated and developed among members, it's cultivated and developed among people outside of the institution. And so what they found in states that do have term limits is that it causes more or less a proportional increase in the power of lobbyists, because someone has to have the institutional memory and the institutional knowledge. And it's not going to be from within the institution, it'll be from without it. Recognizing this, I think that in terms of kind of creating a Congress that is more interested in doing things than fighting about things, one solution has to be to rebuild the sources of institutional knowledge, not just letting congressmen win a bunch, but over the past 30 or 40 years, it's been a systematic defunding and devaluing of research staff, of congressional research organizations, of stuff that actually provides the expertise for members. I'd also say that, if there's gridlock as a result of how Congress is structured, over time, that can create an incentive among members to not do anything. If you know that you're never going to be playing with live rounds in Congress, because of a supermajority requirement in the Senate that can never be met, that as a member of the House, the odds of you actually voting on something that becomes law are very low. Then why wouldn't you be an influencer in Congress? Why wouldn't you get a nice salary, TV cameras all the time, and then you just you act a fool, for 2 years, maybe you get reelected, maybe you don't. If you don't, you can get a nice cushy lobbying job and you're good. The extent to which I think the structure of Congress as it's currently constituted contributes to all these bad things, I don't think can be overrated. I think a Congress less bound by these structural constraints, more able to kind of just like act, with speed and can act without so much gridlock, would be a Congress that is much less attractive to the worst possible people. If when you get that job, you actually have to work, I think.
Yeah, you might not take it.
Well, that you bring up really interesting points that I hadn't necessarily considered. I would offer a slightly different answer for the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
So one package idea of reform that I think would be really compelling for the Supreme Court would be 18-year terms, after which they would cycle on to basically an emeritus board that would still be present to help adjudicate ethics questions, maybe if there was a tie or something of that nature, such that they would not lose their life status. So this would potentially not require a constitutional amendment. I think lawyers are kind of split on whether that would actually require it. I've seen compelling arguments in both cases. Anyway, they would cycle onto an emeritus board. And how that would work is basically every 2 years, the president would appoint a new justice and a new justice would cycle off, they would still be political appointments because presidents would still be appointing them, but it would be very clear when the next one was coming. And it would make very clear your vote for a president is a vote for 2 justices, which I think that sort of clarity is missing because now there's like, is someone going to retire or are they not? Is someone going to leave or are they going to die unexpectedly? And I think that uncertainty is where the gamesmanship starts to come from. And I think 18-year terms are lengthy. They're enough to establish a sizable tenure. After that, I'm not sure you really need to be making all of those decisions.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I agree with, I think Jamelle laid out the arguments on pro and con better than I could ever do it. And I love Lindsay's suggestion on the Supreme Court because I think I'd have to go with term limits. I think it's a good idea, not only for Congress, but for the Supreme Court as well. And I like Lindsay's proposal there. I'd sign that in a second if I was in a position to do so.
I have a pen. But
I will vote for you to be in that position.
There we go.
Please.
There we go. But here's why I really like the term limits. And it's because I remember when I was in law school, we used to go play basketball in the gym. We'd have to pick up games. And they had to have an ambulance on standby, right? Because no one wanted to lose. Because if you lost, then you had to sit out about 3 or 4 games and, you didn't get your workout. This is what's going on. Nobody wants to lose because they know when they lose, the person's going to be in there for life, or at least for 3 or 4 terms, and they're not going to have their chance. So I love the term limits because I think it would change a little bit the dynamic of, winner take all forever.
great points. And
There's totally another question, but I want to build on that, not disagree to build on that, because I think both of you are getting to something that I think is important. Since we're at Madison's home, I think we can get to a Madisonian idea, which is that Madison's thought about how to design representation, how to design the structure of government, but there needs to be certainty and uncertainty. Some things, there needs to be continuity. There needs to be people that they're not going to change. But other things, especially when it comes to competition, when it comes to competition between branches or among representatives, there needs to be a certain amount of uncertainty. You can't know that you're going to win. And I think maybe one of the issues that we're finding in our current system is that partisan polarization, geographical polarization, the way it interacts with the political system means that you might be able to know you're going to win and that you're going to win for a while. And if you know that, why would you compromise? Why would you take the L on occasion? Because you know that even if you lose maybe once, there's a pretty good chance you're going to win again. So why bother trying to pull back the brakes? And I think when we're thinking about reforms, I think the kinds of reforms that make sense for Congress, for example, are ones that increase the level of uncertainty, make it more difficult to know who's going to win the majority in the next race. Maybe, and this is the case for reforms that try to sort of create a multi-party system of 3, 4, 5 parties. Maybe you want to create a system where there's no one who can get a majority. And so coalitions and compromise are necessary at all points for anything to get done. And that changes how people interact with each other. Versus with the Supreme Court, you want certainty. You want to avoid gamesmanship. You want to avoid the kinds of problems that can come when there's profound uncertainty, especially for positions so powerful. So it's sort of like, where do you want there to be certain knowledge? Where do you want there to be uncertainty? Is, I think, the question to ask about the political system. And I think it's a kind of a Madisonian way to think about it.
It is a very Madisonian concept. Yeah. Certainty and a mixture of certainty and uncertainty. Let's see if we can get to a lightning round of questions here, because I know we have a lot, and we're I don't want to go too far over time. This is a fascinating discussion.
People ask a couple of
Yeah,
them, and then we
Yeah,
can see
sure.
if we can
Let's do
build
that.
up
If we could ask a
answers.
few questions and then combine answers. Maybe you could, the microphone is with Katie in the
All
back.
right.
I'm sorry.
Yep. Significant social problem that I see is the common good. This set of shared values has been damaged and ignored or forgotten by too many over the last 40 years. One set of shared values are the half dozen which are shown in the preamble of the Constitution. So it's a way to get started. I think another comment is we've not talked at all about psychologically how do we influence people. And part of the job of education is to make you aware of biases. And what can you do about biases? There's a lovely book that's called Mistakes Were Made, but Not by Me. It's in its third edition now. It's written by a psychologist, and it's been shall we say, free of jargon. So you don't have to dig your dictionary out in order to read the book.
Thank you. Katie, why don't you ask? Yeah.
Just real quick, do you think, and I can't believe I'm saying this, bringing back earmarks would get people to compromise and work together? You know, I'll give you this, you give me that. Since we pulled those pretty much out of the system, it might be a way to like jumpstart a little bit of cooperation.
You started out talking about education and moved on to history, and then talked about the things that are missing from the Constitution. And one thing that's missing is any provision for public education. And so I'm curious about whether you see a role for public education in the maintenance of this democracy.
Maybe one more and then we'll.
You commented that the US Constitution is the oldest written constitution still. It's also the shortest. Do you think there's a correlation?
Great questions. Thank you. So we have 4 questions. Pick and choose. All rich.
I'll give a really short answer because I feel strongly about this. I think we should bring back earmarks to the extent that they haven't already been. I don't think it's not going to solve everything, but I think that in the absence of earmarks, in the absence of sort of like, you vote for this, I give you this, people compete on sort of like, well, how ideological can I be, right? Like, how rigid can I be? That's sort of, in terms of actual elections, right? Sort of, you know, I can't run and promise you X in terms of an actual deliverable. So I'm going to run and promise I'm going to be the most, you know, extreme person I can be and represent you in that way. And I think everything we can do to like encourage and incentivize lawmakers to think about their jobs in terms of kind of like material representation of people is a good thing. And so like earmarks would be a good thing. It's a little bit of corrupt, but as one Tammany Hall boss once said, nothing wrong with a little honest graft.
Thank you. Anybody?
I would just say that I like the title of that book. Mistakes were made, but not by me. I think I'd like to write. I wish I had written that book. But I don't. I mean, they're great questions, but I don't have any real things to add. So I'll just keep my mouth shut on this.
One idea, so this is something I'm still sort of workshopping in my brain. I don't know how I actually feel about it, but it would address, I think, maybe some of the public education, but also the bias and the trying to bring people together for a common good. A lot of other nations have a national service requirement. One way, I don't know that we want to compel military service, but one way that we could make that more expansive is to have some sort of requirement for service broadly conceived. So whether that is serving in a school in an area that you are not from, whether that is working for something like AmeriCorps, whether that is serving abroad, whether that is serving in the military. One of the benefits of these institutions, and one of the benefits that was initially conceived of universities, of higher learning, is that it brought together people from a lot of different areas. It forced you to learn about other types of Americans. And one of Washington's ideas that he actually left, and he left money for this, was to have a national university in the federal city that would bring together people from all over the country so that they could see that their differences between North and South or East and West were not quite as extreme as they thought. And I think a lot of universities still serve this purpose, but of course, not everyone has the opportunity to go to university or to go maybe to school at a place where they don't live. So they don't get that same sort of diverse perspective. But if there was a national service component to it, you could get that same experience. And I think it would be a really good thing for young people, especially, to be able to see different places, meet different people, and hopefully broaden their horizons.
I'd sign that one too. Somebody mentioned that the Constitution was the shortest one.
Right here.
Yeah, the shortest one. And it just kind of triggered something in my mind. We were talking about South Africa last night and the Constitution there. And one of I worked on the new Constitution in South Africa. And one of the things that I was so impressed with, or so proud of, was that it began, "We the people of South Africa." And of course, that's taken directly from the American Constitution. I don't want to talk about some of the things I was disappointed about, except to say that the South African Constitution is one that has second and third generation rights in it. Our Constitution is a negative Constitution. It's one that says you can't, the government can't do this to you. The government can't do that. No illegal searches and seizures, that kind of stuff. But the South African Constitution has stuff in it like you're entitled to decent housing. You're entitled to employment and Social Security. And a problem in South Africa is it's hard for them to deliver that because they're not as rich as we are. But I would like to see, if we ever have a new constitutional convention here, I would like to see some thought, some debate, some discussion on maybe whether we should have second and third generation rights, that people have a right to a minimum quality education in our country. Maybe that's a constitutional amendment that we could support, or that people are entitled to, a minimum decent wage, or that a minimum decent standard of living. And it's something that we, as the richest country in the world, could deliver. And so I just thought about that.
One of my hot takes is that the Privilege and Immunities Clause, it kind of can be interpreted to include that.
Could be.
Could be.
And you know what? Maybe we'll get 5 justices to do that interpretation.
Put me on the Supreme Court.
There we go.
I promise you won't regret it.
Katie, do we have time for a couple more? And then we'll wrap up.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My first question was in regards to the distribution of power, where you have regions of the country where people who are citizens who may be Black or returning citizens are being increasingly restricted from accessing that voting power, that democratic right. How would you see a way of kind of ensuring that protection? A second question of mine was, do you think the competing interests have caused a state of balance, or has it caused an intrinsic imbalance that we're still seeing play out? And I guess just the last quick third one would be, Yeah, I'm just going to leave it at those two.
I feel like I saw someone,
Yeah, I
yeah.
think there was a hand over here. That's been up.
You mentioned proportional allocation of electoral college votes. Do you fear that might lead to more contingent elections and the incentives would be aligned to state delegations? And how might that compare to other methods like direct popular vote or alternative methods that have been proposed?
One more.
Thank you.
So this was billed as a discussion of the current political crisis, but you really haven't talked too much about the current political crisis. I mean, our lawyer on the left, Mr. Higginbotham or Dr. Higginbotham, talked about this irrelevant QAnon thing, but other than that, the main proposals that you all have made will all have the effect of reducing the power of the rural vote and enforcing the power of the urban vote. I think that's the general theme that the various suggestions you all made are. So I'm just wondering, are you sure that you're really addressing a crisis, or is the assertion of a crisis just because you kind of are all three coming from the same bubble?
Thank you for the questions. I don't know if the three are coming from any bubble, but let's have a conversation about this and then wrap up.
I work for the New York Times, but I've never lived in New York, and my family's from rural Georgia. So like, I don't think I'm coming from this other bubble. I don't think that the idea is to reduce the representation of people in rural areas. I'd even question whether rural people have as much representation as you think they do. I mentioned that said about California, that there are more Trump voters in LA County, but California as a whole had, I think, about 3 or 4 million people who voted for Donald Trump. How many presidential candidates, how many Republican presidential candidates, how many Republican politicians go to those people who are predominantly in the rural interior of California and ask for their vote? Western Massachusetts, Western New York, the center of Pennsylvania. These are places that get relatively little attention from national politics, despite containing large numbers of rural people. I think that when you actually look at how representation actually sorts out in this country, it's not rural versus urban. It's simply an accident of who lives in the largest, most competitive state. Congratulations, you live in Florida. People care a lot about your vote. People care a lot about your interests because it's very competitive. Being rural or urban has nothing to do with it. In Florida, I think being the 3rd largest state by population would suggest that the focus on Florida is a kind of urban overrepresentation. Texas, right? Texas is a massive state, a super state with millions of people in its urban centers and millions of people in its rural hinterlands, you might say. And, Texas politicians certainly make themselves visible on the national stage, but how much representation do Texans actually get in terms of their interest by the national government? I think that the misconception is that equalizing political representation between people would somehow disenfranchise or reduce the representation of urban people in favor of rural people in favor of urban people. But I think the thing I'll propose to you is that first, instead of seeing it as states, see it as people in regions. And there are big rural regions in Virginia. There are big rural regions in Illinois, in California, New York. States that tend to be blue or are blue. There are big urban regions in red states. Oklahoma City, big urban region. Again, I mentioned Texas, San Antonio, massive city, one of the largest in the country. Boise, Idaho, modest city, but still a city with city-like characteristics. And so because actual political views don't sort out neatly red state by blue state, and because when you're thinking in terms of national elections, if every vote counts equally, that doesn't mean you need to win California. What does that even mean in that case? It means you need to win the most votes in California. And winning the most votes in California might mean for a candidate focusing all their attention on the underserved rural people of California. The other thing I'll note here is that I think people have a skewed notion of the distribution of America's population. Only like 10% of Americans live in California. If you actually begin to, I'm a nerd and I've done this. If you total up sort of, rural.
14 or something like that. 47 million, 330 million Americans, so more than 10.
11, 12, 13, 14? 16, all right, 60% of Americans. But if you begin to sort of just like break down the numbers, it actually is astonishingly difficult to win an election, a national election, by focusing entirely on urban centers. You do have to make outreach to places that aren't that, and vice versa. You can probably win a national election doing minimally well in urban centers and very well in rural areas. You see that happen on the state level all the time. So that's just, I would say that these, like my concern, right? Like my grandparents, while they were lived in a tiny town in rural Georgia and had virtually no political representation on account of the fact that that place was rural and predominantly Black. And so they had representatives, but they were routinely outvoted. And no one really cared that much about the specific issues facing that community. And I think there are lots of places like that in this country. I think that if there were something more like the equal weight of all people and a politician's ability to build broad coalitions across areas, across regions, based off the equal weight of all people, would be better for the representation of people in areas like that than our current system, where there is the image of rural representation, but no actual substantive rural representation.
So building off of that, this proportional electoral college idea I have would actually give people in rural areas like Virginia, you mentioned, a voice that they don't currently have. So the last couple of presidential elections, Virginia has been a blue state. As you see the votes come in, you see the blue sections around Northern Virginia, you see the blue sections around Richmond, around Charlottesville, around a few other places. And then you see the huge red swaths especially in the southwest corner. Their votes don't count really in the Electoral College, because if it is a blue state, then all of those delegates go to the blue candidate and vice versa. And so that is also true in a place like Florida, where maybe you have blue pockets and red pockets. And so if you have a proportional system, then what that means is your vote is actually really counted more. It is counted more accurately than if you have a winner take all system. And it gives people a much more, I think, a powerful voice in national elections than it would if we continued this winner take all system. Now, sometimes that means in a place like Florida, if that ends up going for a red state, then the blue pockets are going to get some more votes. But sometimes in a place like California, it means there's going to be a huge pickup of red votes in places, especially along the interior of the state. And so I think that if we're thinking about democracy in voting, we have to think about how best for all votes to count. And sometimes that means we're going to like the outcome, and sometimes it means we are not going to like the outcome, because that's actually what a democracy is sometimes we win and sometimes we don't. Now, in terms of the contested election concept that you're talking about, I think these reforms would have to go hand in hand with some protections that would protect the outcome of the vote. So I am personally not comfortable with any state legislature having the ability to overthrow the votes of citizens, regardless of whether it's a red state or a blue state. I don't care. I want votes to count as they are counted, and I don't want a legislature to be able to overturn that. I would hope that most citizens in a democracy could agree with that subject, because we want our votes to count. We want them to matter. And so I think that would be an appropriate reform as well, along with this process.
Also, in terms of like a presidential election, because there's going to be 2 candidates or potentially 3 candidates in the ballot, you would want some kind of like runoff, some sort of mechanism if you're having proportional voting. Kind of the one of the challenges of making a big national change to our political system is the Electoral College, not just in terms of like counting votes, but in terms of how it structures a 2-party system. If you have to have a majority of electoral votes, it's a massive disincentive to having more than 2 parties or 2 candidates on the ballot. And you can see that happen right in real time. The timeline of American presidential election very quickly becomes 2 sides, because that is the most rational and logical thing to happen given the requirements. So you got to also think, if you want a multi-party Congress, if you want more than 2 candidates on the ballot for a presidential election and for everyone to have kind of a fair chance of winning, how do you structure the entire political system beyond just like tweaking a couple of rules?
Thank you. Michael?
Yeah, I'll be quick. I'm not sure what bubble this puts me in, but I like some of the proposals. I'm a big supporter of 1 person, 1 vote. I'm a big supporter of encouraging democratic participation. I'm a big supporter of I want everybody to come out and vote. And so many of these proposals I've heard will help to do that, will encourage people to do that. Our participation in our democratic process today is embarrassing. 30%, 40%, maybe a presidential year, we're close to 50%, but we need to, we need to encourage people to participate in our political process, not to discourage them. And so there's a number of things that we're doing today that do just that. And I think if we adopt policies and practices that encourage people to participate and vote rather than discourage them, I think we'll be better off.
Thank you, Michael. And I just want to add to that, which is there has been a pretty succinct expression of what the crisis that we're facing today. And I've heard it from all three, which is that we're kind of facing a crisis of, I think, Jamelle, you said audacity. Someone else said the democratic spirit, and that we're trying to, reinvigorate the democratic spirit. That can be translated to voter participation. It can be looked at in terms of various different mechanisms. But really, I think the idea that I've heard today is that the Madisonian ideals that were formed right here in this very place are still alive and well and need to be reinforced and preserved, and they're worth defending. So I want to thank all of my panelists for a brilliant conversation. And I want to thank you as well.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Hey, thank you, Jim.